Hello my dears, I did not expect my video on the issues with the history of the curious incident of the dog in the nighttime to become a discussion about why Mark Haddon is a misunderstood icon who I truly adore and would also like to befriend and or give a hug if he's chill with that. But you know, here we are. This is happening, I guess. The first thing to be noted is that my thesis advisor said that if I made a video that potentially criticized Curious Incident that could jeopardize our rights to be able to produce the first all-Nerdy Virgin cast and crew production of the show, we would lose permissions maybe. I think that might have been a little bit over dramatic, but just to cover my bases, I adored this book and play with my whole heart. It's also way less problematic than I thought it was going into this. My criticisms are directly related to my complete and utter love of the content, and with the speed at which the Neurodivergent movement has been changing over the past 30 years it's actually existed, I understand that everything done was so revolutionary, is so revolutionary and important as a stepping stone to where we are today, and I can only strive to vaguely improve how cool it originally was with my production of the show. So please let us make it happen. Now I do think that my advisor is convinced that I'm unnecessarily harsh and have no backups in my criticisms about things, and she also probably doesn't understand the concept of social media, so I might be completely and totally fine. But either way, I just want to make sure we good. Also, that was not an earthquake. If the camera looked like it was, my leg was bouncing and I realized the camera was shaking, so I'm sorry about that. Now, for those of you who don't know who I am or what the heck I'm talking about, hi, my name is Sydney Zarlingo. Want to give you my last name? That's my name. My pronouns are they, them. I'm a disability media analyst and disabled actor and musician, and the capstone for my thesis is the first all-Nerdy Virgin cast and crew production of The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime at my college, in which I will be also playing Christopher, and I wanted to figure out the history behind the original book and the show so that in changing it a bit to make the political statement that I intend to be making with it, I will still stay very true to the source material and just add a little bit onto it and kind of change what audience it's for, if that makes sense. Like, we're gonna be tearing it apart and putting it back together, but we intend to use the vast majority of the same building blocks in creating the show, if that makes sense. Also, image description, I'm a white person in my early 20s with brownish, blondish, curly hair at shoulder length. I'm currently wearing a cream and red plaid shirt. Yep. And I'm sitting in front of a bookshelf that has books and some odds and ends and some flowers that are yellow. And I was going to put on the trademark autism sweatshirt for the sake of looking like Christopher, but it is very much 80 degrees Fahrenheit and my room is a bit of a sauna because the sun's in it for many hours of the day, so that's not happening. I'll let you imagine that with your brains. But yeah. Moving on. So, earlier this week, I had my first production meeting for the show. Oh my god, it's happening. Oh my god, what? We were handed our scripts, so I now have 4 scripts, which might be too many scripts, but I'm not positive on that. I might need a 5th. And I read and analyzed both the script and the book, planned some production aspects, wrote down a lot of questions, and then did a heck ton of research into the people behind the book, behind the play, and the historical context in which all of these things took place, because I cannot express how important the historical context is for our analysis of the story. And I think people are like, oh, but this book is recent, so we can critique it with a modern lens, without realizing that the neurodivergent movement is only about 30 years old, and this book came out about 10 years into the movement, and the play came about 20 years into the movement. And as much as I love the autistic community, our understanding of nuance can be sketchy at best, so I'm going to try to explain all the nuance of why we should, as a community, thank Mark Haddon for his service, and also go way easier on the whole thing. Cool? Great. Now, to begin with, if you're unfamiliar with the story of Curious Incident, I am not going to spoil it for you because the story will wreck you in a good way and you really just need to read it or come to my play. You can come to my play. So I'll give you the Amazon description of the book instead. Okay, I'm going to change what I just said. So I started reading the Amazon description and it's super ableist and very offensive and uses a lot of bad terms. So we're going to ignore that and we're going to read the Goodreads one instead. So this says, Christopher John Francis Boone knows all the countries of the world and their capitals and every prime number up to 7,057. He relates well to animals but has no understanding of human emotions. He cannot stand to be touched and he detests the color yellow. This improbable story of Christopher's quest to investigate the suspicious death of a neighborhood dog makes for one of the most captivating, unusual, and widely heralded novels in recent years. So there you go. I also want to say that I initially read this book as a summer reading book going into the 9th grade. That's how I realized I was autistic. And seeing the national tour when I was, I think, a junior in high school, that prompted me to seek a diagnosis. And then when I was told the theater isn't made for people like you, I tried to find people like me in professional theater settings, and the literal only one I found was my now close friend Mickey Rowe, who is best known as being the first autistic person to play Christopher Boone in Curious Incident. And he inspired me to believe that I was good enough for professional theater and to start trying to work for them. I'm so good at words, guys. That's my job. So anyway, Curious Incident might be the reason that I have a career in the future. It's the reason I'm diagnosed. It's the reason I do what I do, and I love it to pieces for that reason as well, and the show yeah. So, I just want to let you know my emotional attachment to the story. But anyway, so let's begin with a fairly long quote from a book review that I read because it summarizes the majority of my thoughts while rereading this book last week. Early on, I had my doubts. Christopher starts out so autistic that he's almost a cliche. He allows only prime-numbered chapters in his story. His inability to deal with other people or the slightest change in his routine is a little overstated. At first, the book appears to be a somewhat ham-handed treatment of its subject. But things quickly get better, though. Christopher has interesting and credible relationships with his dad, his neighbors, and his social worker at school. He also meets a surprising number of police officers who are bewildered by his behavior. He applies his intelligence in creative but surprising ways to the curious incident at hand. He gets into all sorts of trouble during the course of his adventure, and in the end, he solves the mystery he started out with, and a few others besides. When I was rereading the book this week and the play, I found it interesting that he emotionally handles being like touched by his dad at the beginning in the exact same way that he handles like just genuine trauma later, like identically, which is very strange. Like more or less his emotional responses and the range of them stay the same throughout the book. It's just that the stakes around him get higher and higher. And honestly, it felt kind of like at the beginning of writing this book, the author was like, I need to show that he is different with a capital D, so I'm going to shoehorn some things in that are usually related to autism, including that one time that Christopher just does like an insane 3-digit times 3-digit math problem in like 4 seconds. And the other time that he mentions how his teacher did the theory of mind test on him to prove that he doesn't have theory of mind and can't understand empathy, but then it never explains what the study means. I just like am a psychology nerd, and so I know what it means. And I was like, I didn't like having that in there. But anyway, it felt to me that as the book went by and there was less like, this is the characters and more of the mystery, the author relaxed into the character and it became infinitely more natural. I felt like Christopher's world was beautifully messy and Christopher himself was kind of clean and clinical, but honestly that also could have been a deliberate choice by the author to have the whole world revolve around him. Not sure, just an observation. We often see autism as hyperlogical and completely clean and organized without realizing that autistic brains are chaos all of the time, and that is why we tend to be so organized. It's how we like cope with it. But we're gonna get to stereotyping in a hot second. First, let's talk about maturity. I always pictured Christopher to be like a child, like 12 years old maximum. So when I read the book and he says specifically that he's 15 years, 3 months, and 2 days old, that in my brain, still kind of a child. But when I was reflecting on the story throughout how like Christopher is so good at explaining what's going on inside of his head and what he's good at explaining what he does and doesn't understand and how he experiences certain things. And I was like, I feel like I didn't have the emotional intelligence to understand all of these things until I did an extensive amount of therapy for like 5 years after several medical crises to be able to do this. And that made me take a pause to think about how old he really is and like compare it to my own life. And I realized that when I was his age, I was in the spring of my sophomore year of high school. And that's actually when I did my very first solo traveling trip. And it was like 2 to 3 years into my extensive therapy. So it actually is about right. And initially I was a little mad about how he is written like a child. But first of all, when you're an adult, the difference between 10 and 13 and 16 are very negligible in your brain. They're all children. All of the ages are still baby. And also, as much as we don't like being infantilized as autistic people and disabled people, autistic people are often perceived by society to be younger than their chronological age just because of social norms. We've talked about that before. You can watch it up here. Now, I also had a conversation with a friend who said that they would consider Christopher to be based on the old criteria that doesn't exist anymore, more on the autism side rather than the Asperger side. Today we would diagnose it probably about level 2 autism, and to potentially have had an intellectual disability. As somebody who grew up hyper sheltered and acted a lot like Christopher without realizing it for a good portion of my life, I think it's significantly more that he's just only ever been to like 4 places in his life and his parents have no resources on how to parent him, so they're just like not doing the best job of it, you know? And that brings us to the one major thing that I struggled with, which was the narrative of autism will ruin your marriage, because that for me brings up a very visceral response in my soul, because Autism Speaks had that one, if you don't know what Autism Speaks is, go watch this video over here. One of their campaigns for a while was like, autism will ruin your marriage, which was disgusting and horrifying. But then I checked myself and I realized 2 things. One, Judy seems bad at picking men to begin with. Christopher just brought out their true colors in the same way that somebody can seem decent and then their kid comes out as trans and you find out that they're super transphobic. Or anything like that. That stuff happens. That is real. Second of all, the Autism Speaks campaign ran 6 years after this book was published, so he didn't know that was a stereotype. Because it wasn't at the time. Because here's the deal. Curious Incident was published in 2003. Before this book, the only representation really out there, like vaguely in the popular lens, was Temple Grandin's book and Rain Man. And we think of Christopher as incredibly stereotypical, but we don't realize that all of the stereotypes they're all copycats that came after this book. This book, Christopher was the first by a long shot. And then the book won tons of awards because it's incredible. And then everybody started writing traumatic stories from the lens of autistic or disabled children because that's fun, cool, and different. And it's a different way to look at the world, except most people did a really, really bad job of it in relation to representation. And I've personally found in my research that older disability rep is often infinitely better than the representation that we get today because it was less done back then. So they had less to build off of and less stereotypes in their brain from the media, and usually based it more on real people. But that's a discussion for another day. Also, we can very much rage against stereotypes all we want, but stereotypes do honestly exist for a reason. It's because there are people out there who are really like Rain Man, who are really like Christopher. The issue is that we don't see enough of other kinds of people. And frankly, Christopher's not really stereotypical. He's right in line with the representation that was seen before him, except this time he's a child, and also his story is better than the other two. And I personally found rereading this, it really depends on also how you picture the character and you interact with him. Like, this time through, I pictured him as a combination of some of my favorite autistic people in my life and myself, and then he felt completely and totally natural. I think, like every other representation of literally anything, if you see somebody as fundamentally different from you, you're gonna see that no matter what, no matter how they're portrayed. And if you see somebody as similar to you, as like you, if you see yourself in that character is going to feel closer to who you are. That's just how humans are. And that's also a great segue into talking about the man himself, Mark Haddon, and particularly some quotes the autistic community often takes out of context, and I would like to have a discussion about that. The first is from an interview, and he says, "I've always regretted that the phrase Asperger syndrome appeared on the cover of Curious Incident when it was first published." That does sound bad, but let us look at the rest of what he had to say here. "I've always regretted that the phrase Asperger syndrome appeared on the cover of Curious Incident when it was first published, mostly because the central conceit was that Christopher himself had written the book. For a long time, it had the dull but accurate working title Christopher's book. And Asperger syndrome is not a phrase he uses. In the book, he refers to himself only as someone who has behavioral problems. I prefer the wry humor in these words. I like the way it gently mocks the diagnostic medical language. I like the way it includes all of us, like who doesn't have behavioral problems. But I like it most of all because it's Christopher's own phrase. Labels tell us very little about the person who has been labeled and a lot about the person doing the labeling. If you want to find out who someone is, just ask them." One of the other reasons I regret the words Asperger syndrome appearing on the original cover of Curious Incident is that it sparked a sometimes heated and often misguided debate which rumbles on quietly to this day. In short, is Christopher a correct representation of someone with the condition? The assumption being that there is indeed a correct representation of someone with the condition. I think it is indicative of the way we think about people we label disabled that we can even ask this question. We would never ask if a character in a novel was a correct representation of a cellist or a lesbian or an archbishop. There's no such thing. And the same is true for people who are given the label disabled. They are as various and as individual as any other group in society. But I'm a little uneasy when, as occasionally happens, it is used as a textbook and handed to policemen or social workers to give them some insight into the behavior of people they might come across in their professional lives. I'm in favor of anything that introduces a little more empathy into the world, but I would like to fight the corner for Curious simply as a novel. Of course, it's about disability and our attitudes towards it, but it's about many other things as well. And yeah, if you're mad at Mark Haddon, maybe some of those quotes from this thing don't look very good either, but after watching a lot of interviews with this guy and understanding how he interacts with the world and his tone and such, I wholeheartedly agree with everything that he has to say here pretty much. The more research I do into disability representation and the proper ways to do it, the more I realize that there is no right or wrong way to represent somebody simply because the minority group is so large. You are always going to fall into stereotype and things will always be messy. And he's basically saying that's not an excuse to not write disabled characters. He specifically said in an interview about a new show with the main character with Down syndrome that he wrote, "A lot of roles for people with disabilities are quite patronizing. It's a real pity when they are just used to give dull PC kudos to a drama, or when they're wheeled on in a tokenistic way without any real involvement in the plot. I wanted Ben to drive the story." He also spoke openly in one of the interviews I watched about his anger at the harmful anti-disability legislation that was going on and how he didn't understand why he was getting tax cuts for his income as like having the show about disabled people, and that disabled people were getting less money from the government to survive. And he's genuinely clearly put in the effort to make sure disabled people are represented well and honestly in his works thus far. So yes, it is important to be aware of harmful stereotypes and to try your best not to fall into those, but based on his works and how he speaks about disability, he is clearly very, very aware. And I've seen a lot of autistic people frustrated with Haddon that his book is being used to educate people everywhere about autism, But that's not his fault. Like, he seems just as annoyed and upset about it and concerned about it. And the issue here is, well, there kind of are now a little bit, but at the time there definitely weren't resources about it that were easily digestible and understandable and not straight medical information. And it's not his fault. He's just a writer trying to add more types of people into the literary canon. He's not a disability educator, and he knows that. The other quote that I often see out of context is from a blog post on his website in 2009. Unsurprisingly, I'm often asked to talk about Asperger's and autism or to become involved with organizations who work on behalf of people with Asperger's and autism, many of whom do wonderful work, but I always decline for 2 reasons. 1, I know very little about the subject. I did no research for Curious Incident other than photographing the interiors of Swindon and Paddington stations. I'd read Oliver Sacks' essay about Temple Grandin and a handful of newspaper and magazine articles about or by people with Asperger's and autism. I deliberately didn't add to this list. Imagination always trumps research. I thought that if I could make Christopher real to me, then he'd be real to readers. I gave him some rules to live by and some character traits and opinions, all of which I borrowed from people I know, none of whom would be labeled as having a disability. Judging by the reaction, it seems to have worked. And yeah, again, looks bad, but let's continue and discuss what's going on here. 2, Curious Incident is not a book about Asperger's. It's a novel whose central character describes himself as a mathematician with some behavioral difficulties. Indeed, he never uses the word Asperger's or autism. I slightly regret that fact that the word Asperger's was used on the cover. If anything, it's a novel about difference, about being an outsider, about seeing the world in a surprising and revealing way. It's as much a novel about us as it is about Christopher. Labels say nothing about a person, they say only how the rest of us categorize that person. Good literature is always about peeling labels off, and treating real people with dignity is always about peeling the labels off. A diagnosis may lead to practical help, but genuinely understanding another human being involves talking and listening to them and finding out what makes them an individual, not what makes them part of a group. I passionately believe this, and I've said it repeatedly in many different forms. To become a spokesperson for those with Asperger's or autism, or to present myself as some kind of expert in the field, would completely undermine this and make me look like a fool to the bargain. I would much rather spend my time writing more novels, standing up for difference, and trying to understand outsiders who see the world in surprising and revealing ways. And again, if you just kind of look at that at face value, it kind of doesn't look great. But in the context of interviews that he's given and how he speaks and how he looks at the world, I think I can accurately interpret that he would rather spend his time and energy and expertise creating more representation rather than teaching other people about representation, because he's not qualified to be doing that. And you might ask, why is he qualified to be writing it? Well, first of all, he worked with intellectually and developmentally disabled people for a while in his earlier life, so when he says he did no research, I can also tell you that, like, I've done no research into how early education works, but I worked at a nursery school for 4 years, so I have the same level of practical knowledge that a researcher probably would. And yes, phrasing, not super great there, but keep in mind that first of all, the autistic movement was so different in 2009 to where it is right now. Asperger's was not removed as a diagnostic criteria until about 4 years after he put up this post. And also, we could argue that only disabled people should write disabled characters, sure, but I do have 2 issues with that. First of all, there are more non-disabled writers than there are disabled writers, just like statistically that is the case. So if we want to see disabled representation as normalized and regular, we need to trust non-disabled people to also create disabled characters. Sure, it will always be best from lived experience, that's not even a question, but we should not go around telling people that they can't write certain kinds of characters. Should there be more disabled writers? Yes, there are not enough. There definitely should be more, but that does not mean that non-disabled people should not at all ever write disabled characters, because those are 2 very separate conversations. Secondly, a lot of people are disabled and don't know, or they do know and they choose not to out themselves, and that's super valid. And I'm not a fan of armchair diagnosing at all whatsoever, and I don't think that's fair or okay to do in any situation. But I will say that in this case, Haddon does talk a lot about how much of him is in Christopher and how he has similar existential crises to the character. And one article I read about an interview with him described the magpie nature of his mind and explained him in the most strange and bizarre way humanly possible. I've linked in the description if you're interested. Who knows, he might identify as autistic, or maybe he didn't then and he does now. Maybe he's chosen not to out himself, or maybe he has no clue, or maybe he just started writing a character as autistic, got scared because it was too close to his own reality, and he shoehorned in some stereotypes to make it more distant. Or maybe he's just really good at writing a disabled character because, if anything, we are all human beings, and autistic people are human beings with brains as much as are non-autistic people. And all of these things can be true, and it's not our place to speculate or judge. What I think we instead need to do is take a step back, not automatically attack anybody who's genuinely helping our community because we are holding them to present day standards. Though I will say the one thing that did kind of set me off, I'm going off my script here, this isn't gonna go well, but one thing that did kind of make me feel a little weird is he did kind of talk about how we should get rid of labels. I think yes, I don't think we're there yet, if that makes sense, because he says it's important to appreciate people without their labels and take them off and ignore them. But that's a little bit kind of like the we should just be colorblind and treat everybody the same. I don't think as a society we're there yet. I agree, but we're not there yet. But also, he might know that and didn't phrase it that way. I don't know. But again, we shouldn't be attacking somebody who's genuinely helping our community and expecting them to be perfect and explain everything perfectly all the time up to the perfect standards that we have, because he's a human and he's absolutely killing it. And I think that he would be a very delightful human to do a crossword puzzle with in a coffee shop. I don't know. Like, sure, there's nuances to what he has to say about wanting his story to not be about disability and whatnot, and that can hit wrong to some people, but I do think that on some level it is true. We have a tendency, myself included, it's literally my job to judge characters in media, that's literally what I do, to focus so much on the good and bad of a portrayal that we forget that the story itself is good, that there is more to be learned from the story than there is individually with a character. I think some of the things that he says are very true, but we're just, as I said earlier, not culturally able to swallow them yet. But frankly, like, what else would you expect from somebody who wrote a book about a stabbed dog narrated by an autistic person in a time before people were even comfortable using the word autism? Like, this all checks out precisely with what we would expect from this person, and I don't know why we're surprised. But anyway, let's talk about the play. Now, looking at our historical timeline, the play premiered on August 12th, 2012. This is a year-ish before Asperger's was removed from the DSM and about 20 years into the existence of the neurodivergence movement. So still a very, very long way from where we are now. I would also argue that over the pandemic, our movement, went at 300 times speed. But anyway, my first question was, why did they adapt it as a play? And I learned that the answer is literally everybody wanted to adapt it for literally anything. Like, there was films suggested, there were plays, even musicals. Like, there were musicals suggested. And Haddon just kept going, no, this is unadaptable. But then his good friend Simon Stevens went, can I do it? And Haddon said, I only trust you. And now here we are. Stevens wrote the play based on the book, to the T, and he tried to keep it as equally abstract as the book was, which I think is really, really cool and interesting. And Haddon and Stevens knew that they wanted to make their show to be kind of physical and different aesthetically to kind of fit the vibe of the book in its abstractness. So they hired Marianne Elliott, who is the director of the play Warhorse, or musical, I don't remember, which was also very physical and kind of abstract and really cool puppetry and all that stuff. And also bonus points for hiring a woman, because there's not nearly enough lady directors out there. We love to see it. And they also teamed up with Frantic Assembly, which is a physical theater devising group in the UK that has done some really, really cool stuff. Also, their book is so delightful to read because the whole thing is, we're not trained in what we're doing, but everybody says we're the best at it, so here's how we do it. Hope that's really helpful for you. And it's really helpful, and I love it, and it's beautiful. Now, in regards to research based on interviews, it did seem like they talked to a lot of teachers in special needs school and spent a lot of time with autistic children. The director specifically talked about how they realized how vastly different everybody in the spectrum is and how they needed to focus more on the source material, which at first hit me wrong, but no, she's right, and shoving every stereotype in one physicality is never going to look good. The guy playing Christopher did specifically talk about how helpful to his character it was for him to sit in a classroom and observe autistic children. That also struck me kind of wrong, not in the sense of that phrasing, because I mean it probably was helpful, but there is a discussion in the world of CRIPFACE, which is non-disabled people playing disabled characters, but there is so much focus on acting the disability section of the character that they forget to put all of that energy into acting the human personality part. Which means it's a great time to talk about casting. When Stevens was asked about the discussion of whether or not they would cast a disabled person in the role or not, which the article specifically said CRIPFACE is bad, and then was like, in the case of The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime, a curious catch-22 exists. Haddon's book doesn't specifically diagnose Christopher Boone, which is a choice. And Stevens said, that is the most important question. It's something myself and the whole artistic team wrestled with artistically from the play's inception. And the issue of representation is tremendously sensitive to all kinds of people throughout the world. But in this case, my specific responsibility was to dramatize Mark Haddon's fictional creation. That might sound like a cop-out, but at every point I had to remember that touchstone. What did Mark do? I'm often asked about the idea of authenticity, and I feel like it is a very problematic word when you're talking about the theater. Our work isn't about recreating authentic life, it's about creating a dramatized experience. So I never really see the burden of authenticity because I don't think authenticity is useful in that context. I'm going to very kindly call that out a little bit as very much a cop-out answer. Because yes, a man can play a woman's role. That is acting. But should a man play a woman's role when all women are effectively barred from ever getting the chance to play any role regardless of gender, and this would be their one chance to maybe change that and make a political point? No, he should not, because that's unfair to the minority population. And so much of the publicity for the show was focused on interviewing the people playing Christopher and asking them what it was like to learn about and step into the shoes of an autistic person. And that does not just That doesn't sit right with my soul. You can very well say that, sure, he's never diagnosed in the book, but keep in mind that the original book does describe Chris as having Asperger's, like on the cover of the book. And Haddon might not like that, but he did do it. So he is autistic, and that's not a question, and he should be played by a disabled person. That's also not a question. I will say the discussions of Cryptface were a little bit different back then, not majorly different, but it's very clear to me that they had just never seen an autistic actor before, so they didn't think that good ones existed, and so they chose not to search for one. And you can call that absurd, but please read my friend Mickey's book, which includes his experience. Where is it? Haha. It includes his experience of nearly being cast in the national tour. Read it, and then come back to me and go, oh, you're right, because I am. No shade against anybody involved. Cryptface does not set off alarm bells in people's heads as much as blackface or drag does. It's also the reason we see straight people playing gay people all the time. I also take issue with that, but that's generational and annoying, but it's generational, so we're moving on. In regards to the actual staging of the show, Stephen specifically said, it's the nation's favorite novel. This can't be a piece of theater that alienates people. And on one level, I think they genuinely did try to achieve that. They created the stage to be the inside of Christopher's brain, so you could understand the inner workings of his brain. You got to see his popcorn thoughts and see how his world was overwhelming and disjointed, and you got to completely and fully connect with every character on that stage. I will also say that they did that by making it very clinical on purpose, and using tons of strobes and wild lighting and very, very loud sound design, like to the point where there was one show at the Apollo where the roof collapsed on the audience during the show and everybody just thought it was part of the show until they were being hit by ceiling. But as an autistic person who went to see this play, I saw the national tour, and then I had to spend 3 days trying to recover from the migraine that it caused, the traditional staging is one of the most inaccessible shows, unfortunately, that I have ever seen. Sure, some sensory-seeking autistics must have loved it, and they did deliberately do some relaxed performances for autistic and disabled audience to be able to go to without issue, and they had a visual story. If you don't know what that is, I have one I have theirs in the description if you want to check it out. And they included lots of other accessibility measures most shows don't have, but something feels icky to me about creating a story about a minority group that is then effectively barred from being able to comfortably see it at any time that media is available to an audience. Did I love it? Absolutely. Was it exciting and engrossing? Absolutely. Did I cry? Several times. But that does not mean that it didn't totally destroy my body for a bit, and also my standards for representation are often very low because we get 0, and this was the first time I'd seen myself on stage, so I was willing to tolerate it. But what it comes down to is that they did all the research. They put in all of the thought, and they did an incredible, incredible job. The issue is that they geared it to a neurotypical audience, and they didn't put a neurodivergent person in the role, so it felt unnatural. And that's genuinely it. The original book explains itself in the same way that I explain myself when I'm trying to write to people who are neurotypical to explain them what I'm feeling and what I'm going through. That writing style is exactly the same in my own narrative as it is in his. He wrote this to explain his story to neurotypical people he knew wouldn't understand them. And the play just played that up on a major scale. And it's for a neurotypical audience. So with that, my production of The Curious Incident opens on April 19th, 2023. We will for sure have shows until the 23rd. We're going to do very early ticket reservations so that we can see if we need to add an extra week of shows. Really hoping that we can do that. I'm kind of planning for it in my brain, but I would love to know what you all want to see in this production. We definitely intend to warm up the design a little bit, make it seem less clinical. We're also going to take out the sensory hell aspects. We are planning to probably change his gender expression costume-wise every night, just so that many different kinds of autistic people can be seen. Definitely taking out the British accents, because that further alienates this character from an American audience, and also distracts people if the accent is bad, and they take so much time out of rehearsal to teach, so that's not worth it to me. And somehow we're gonna have to figure out how to frame the show to teach a neurotypical audience about autism, but also engross them in the story and also feel accessible and catered to the autistic audience as well. And that's gonna be tricky, and I'm nervous, and I'm feeling a lot of pressure to get this perfectly right, but I think it's gonna be really, really, really cool. And I would love to know if you have any ideas, like specific costuming archetypes that you'd love to see. For example, like one of our ideas is baby gay autistic, and another one is hyper femme autistic. What other kinds of autistic fashion are we not thinking about? And also, what specific particular elements of the traditional staging really stuck out to you that you would love to see kept? Anything else you have to say about our show? I want to make this as much of a community-built project as I possibly can, so please let me know in the comments what you think. Also, Mount Holyoke people, stay tuned. We're going to give you information about auditions and stuff like that. So, in conclusion to all of this, as this truck makes a lot of noise next to my window, I think it does us some good to remember that culturally things change really, really quickly, specifically in the world of disability. Do I wish we had our first accessible autistic character written by a disabled author? Sure. But also, you shouldn't have to out your disability just to have your art be legitimate. And also, I think that sometimes we get a little too aggressive and analyze things out of context. And I get it. I catch myself doing that too, but sometimes I think that we forget to take a step back and remember how important something was for its time, how it created the stepping stones to get us to where we are now, how it's part of our historical canon, and how we can improve and grow from that for going into the future. And you're welcome to say that I'm just fawning over this so much because I need to like it because it's going to be my whole life for the next year, but in reality, it's been my life since the 9th grade, and I love every piece of it to the point where I can critique it. And yes, I can critique some things, but when it comes down to it, it's a story. It's a way better representation than Rain Man could ever be. So I do consider it a win. So with that, thank you for listening. Thanks for learning. Remember, it's never too late to start over. Stay tuned for more show updates. Also, we have an Instagram and a TikTok now. They're linked in the description. You should follow them. Also, all of my sources are there if you want to check those out too. And as always, I look forward to seeing you, my dear, in the next one.